I never thought an apology dinner could feel like a trap until the moment I stepped inside my daughter's home in Boston. That evening, the air was unusually crisp, around 52 degrees Fahrenheit, and I remember holding my coat tighter as I stood on the polished stone walkway leading up to Jessica's house, a place I once believed would always feel like family. My name is Margaret Collins, and at 72 years old, I had learned to recognize silence that feels heavier than words. But nothing prepared me for the quiet tension waiting behind that front door. Jessica had called me 3 days earlier, her voice soft in a way I hadn't heard in years, telling me she wanted to heal the past and host a reconciliation dinner for the family. She even used the word forgiveness, as if it had always been missing between us and only needed an invitation to return. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe my daughter still saw me as her mother, and not as a problem to be managed. The moment I stepped inside, everything looked perfect in a way that felt carefully staged rather than warm. The dining room was arranged like a magazine cover, with a long oak table set for 8, crystal glasses catching the light from a chandelier that hummed softly overhead, and soft music playing at just the right volume to make every conversation feel rehearsed. Jessica greeted me at the door with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, pulling me into a hug that lasted a little too long, as if she were performing affection for an audience that hadn't arrived yet. I noticed small details immediately, the kind that most people overlook but I had spent a lifetime reading. My coat was taken and placed in a room far from the main gathering space. My usual seat at family dinners was not at the center of the table but near the end, and the guest list seemed carefully balanced in a way that made me feel like an observer in my own family history. Robert Hayes, my son-in-law, stood near the fireplace checking his phone more than making conversation, while my grandchildren Emma and Lucas played quietly on the living room rug, their laughter softer than I remembered, almost muted under the weight of the evening. Jessica moved through the room with practiced ease, touching shoulders, laughing at small jokes, and introducing the night as something she called a fresh start for our family journey. But every word felt like it had been rehearsed in advance. Still, I told myself this was progress, that families sometimes break before they rebuild, and that maybe this was finally the moment my daughter had chosen to let go of whatever pain had been building between us. But then I noticed something else, something subtle but impossible to ignore. Whenever I spoke, there was a brief pause before anyone responded, as if my words needed to be measured before they were allowed to exist in the room. And in that silence, I began to understand that I had not been invited here to be healed with, but to be evaluated. The evening continued with an unsettling rhythm, as if every moment had been carefully placed on a schedule I had not been shown. Jessica moved through the dining room with confidence, pouring wine for guests, adjusting napkins, and laughing just a second too quickly after every comment, as though she were maintaining control of something invisible that only she could see. I remained seated near the end of the table, observing rather than participating, noticing how conversations around me seemed to flow easily until I spoke, and then briefly slowed, like a room that had learned to pause before acknowledging my presence. Emma and Lucas, my great-grandchildren, were called away from the living room rug and asked to sit closer to their parents, their small voices fading into the background of adult conversation. Robert Hayes finally looked up from his phone more often now, but his attention felt divided, as if he were waiting for something to begin rather than enjoying what was already happening. Jessica eventually raised her glass and tapped it lightly with a spoon, an action so deliberate that the entire room shifted its attention toward her in a synchronized way that felt rehearsed rather than spontaneous. She smiled warmly, but I noticed the way her fingers tightened slightly around the glass before she spoke, as if she were steadying herself for a moment. She had been preparing for far longer than the rest of us realized. She began by thanking everyone for coming to what she called an important night for family reflection and accountability, a phrase that made several guests nod politely without fully understanding what was coming next. Her eyes briefly met mine as she spoke, but only for a second, just enough to acknowledge my presence without inviting it into her narrative. She then shifted her tone, softening her voice in a way that made the room lean in closer, and began talking about the past, about mistakes that could shape generations, about the responsibility adults have toward the emotional well-being of children. At first, her words felt general, almost philosophical, but slowly the direction became clearer, like a path narrowing into something unavoidable. I felt a subtle tightening in my chest, not from fear, but from recognition, the kind that comes when you realize a conversation is no longer about ideas but about a single person being defined in front of others. Jessica mentioned how difficult it had been for her children growing up, how certain influences had left lasting impressions that she was now working hard to undo, and I noticed the way the guests began to shift in their seats, their expressions changing from casual interest to cautious attention. No one interrupted her, and no one asked for clarification, which somehow made the air in the room heavier. Emma looked down at her plate, confused but quiet, while Lucas leaned slightly toward his mother as if seeking comfort without understanding why it was needed. Jessica paused at just the right moment, letting silence stretch across the table before she continued, and in that silence I realized the invitation I had accepted was not for reconciliation at all, but for something far more public, something that was about to redefine my place in a family I had spent my entire life trying to hold together. The room remained still in a way that felt almost unnatural, as if every guest had collectively agreed not to interrupt what was unfolding, and Jessica continued speaking with a calm precision that made her words feel carefully arranged, rather than spontaneously spoken. She adjusted her stance slightly beside the dining table, letting her gaze travel across the room before returning to me, and when she did, there was a change in her expression that I had never seen before, something between determination and restraint, as if she was holding herself back from emotion while still fully committed to what she was about to say. She mentioned the importance of accountability within families again, but this time her tone sharpened, and the general language she had used earlier began to narrow into something far more personal. I could feel it before she said it outright, the way conversations sometimes shift when everyone in the room unconsciously understands that one person is about to be placed at the center of blame. Jessica spoke about how patterns from one generation can affect the next, how children absorb the emotional environment they are raised in, and how those impacts can extend far beyond childhood into adulthood and even into the lives of great-grandchildren. At the mention of great-grandchildren, I noticed several guests glance at Emma and Lucas, who were now sitting quietly with their hands folded, their attention lowered as if they were sensing the weight of the conversation without fully understanding it. Jessica paused again, this time longer, and when she continued, her voice carried a firmness that cut through the room with unsettling clarity. She stated that there had been moments in the family's past that were not as nurturing as they should have been, that certain behaviors had created emotional distance, and that those experiences had left lasting impressions that she had spent years trying to repair. My name was not spoken yet, but I could feel it circling in every sentence, waiting to be attached. The guests shifted slightly in their seats, some lowering their eyes to their plates, others watching Jessica with a mixture of curiosity and discomfort, as if they were waiting for a signal to determine how they should interpret what they were hearing. Robert Hayes finally set his phone down completely, folding his hands in front of him, his expression unreadable but attentive in a way that suggested he already knew where this was going. Jessica then took a breath that felt deliberate, almost rehearsed, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a directness that left no room for ambiguity. She said that one person in particular had shaped much of what the family had struggled with emotionally, and that despite love and respect being present, there had been damage that could not be ignored. In that moment, I understood that the invitation I had accepted was not about healing or reconciliation, but about presentation, about placing a narrative in front of witnesses who had already been guided toward a conclusion. Emma shifted slightly in her chair, looking toward her mother for reassurance, while Lucas remained still, his young face caught between confusion and silence. I felt the air in the room grow heavier, not from any sudden action, but from the collective realization that the conversation had crossed an invisible line from reflection into accusation, and that whatever came next would no longer be about understanding the past, but about deciding who would be held responsible for it. Jessica's pause stretched longer than anyone in the room seemed comfortable with, and in that silence I could feel every pair of eyes slowly adjusting their focus toward me as if a signal had finally been given. She lowered her hand from the glass she had been holding and placed it gently on the edge of the table, her posture now fully composed, her voice calm but carrying a weight that made it impossible to ignore. When she finally spoke my name, it was not loud, but it landed in the room with a clarity that made several guests shift almost instinctively. She said that I had always been a central figure in the family's history, but not in the way that reflected warmth or guidance, and as she continued, the language she used became more precise, more deliberate, as if each sentence had been refined before tonight to ensure it would be received exactly as intended. I remained still, my hands resting on my lap, observing the subtle changes in expression around the table, from curiosity to uncertainty to something closer to quiet judgment. Jessica explained that while she appreciated the sacrifices I had made over the years, there had also been moments where my actions, decisions, and influence had created emotional distance within the household, and she framed each statement in a way that suggested inevitability rather than opinion. Robert Hayes glanced briefly at Emma and Lucas before returning his gaze forward, his silence reinforcing the sense that this was not a discussion but a presentation already in progress. I noticed Emma shifting slightly in her chair, her young face turning toward me with confusion that she was too young to fully understand but old enough to feel, while Lucas remained still, his hands folded tightly as if trying to stay small within the moment. Jessica continued speaking, now referencing the difficulty of raising children under emotional strain, and how those early experiences had shaped the adults they had become today, carefully weaving a narrative that connected past events to present outcomes without ever allowing space for interruption. The guests around the table were no longer eating or drinking, their attention fully absorbed, and even the faint background music seemed to fade into irrelevance. I realized then that the structure of the evening had shifted completely, from a family gathering into something resembling testimony, where each person present had been positioned as a witness to a carefully constructed version of events. Jessica's tone remained controlled, but there was a firmness beneath it that suggested she believed every word she was saying, or at least believed she needed others to believe it. She spoke about responsibility, about emotional impact, and about the long shadow that unresolved conflict can cast across generations, and with each phrase the distance between how I remembered my role in this family and how she was describing it grew wider. No one interrupted her, and no one defended me, not because of agreement, but because the atmosphere itself seemed to discourage response. I could feel the room holding its breath collectively, waiting not for truth, but for conclusion, and in that moment I understood that whatever was about to be said next would not simply define how this night ended, but how I would be seen in every memory that followed. The silence in the room tightened further as Jessica's words settled into the air like something irreversible, and I could feel the weight of every gaze now fully anchored on me without any attempt to disguise it. She stood still at the head of the table, no longer pacing or gesturing, her entire presence now centered on the act of finishing a statement she had been building toward throughout the evening. When she finally resumed speaking, her tone shifted again, becoming more direct, less wrapped in explanation, as if she had moved past justification and arrived at conclusion. She stated that for many years she had struggled to understand certain emotional patterns within the family, and that only recently had she begun to recognize how deeply those patterns had affected her children's upbringing and their sense of stability. The phrasing was careful, but the meaning behind it was no longer ambiguous, and I could see the subtle reactions forming around the table as guests began to interpret her words not as reflection, but as assignment of responsibility. Robert Hayes lowered his eyes briefly, then looked back up, his expression tightening in a way that suggested discomfort with the direction the conversation had taken, yet he did not intervene. Emma shifted closer to her mother's side, her small hand resting on the edge of the chair, while Lucas looked across the table at me for a moment before turning away, as if unsure where to place his attention. Jessica continued, now speaking about how she had spent years trying to create a different environment for her children, one that would allow them to grow without repeating what she described as cycles from the past, and each word seemed to reinforce a narrative that was becoming increasingly structured around a single origin point. I remained silent, not because I had nothing to say, but because I understood that any interruption at this stage would not change the direction of what had already been set in motion. The guests around the table had stopped shifting in their seats, even the smallest movements had slowed as if the room itself had synchronized to a shared expectation of what was about to come. Jessica paused again, this time longer than before, and when she spoke next, her voice carried a clarity that left no room for alternative interpretation. She referenced the impact of earlier family dynamics on the emotional well-being of her children, and how those effects had extended into the present, shaping decisions, relationships, and even how they now viewed trust within the family structure. I could feel the shift becoming complete, the transition from explanation to conclusion, from narrative to verdict, and in that moment I realized that the purpose of the evening was no longer hidden beneath layers of politeness or reflection. It had become a public framing of history, delivered in a setting where every listener had been positioned not as participant in understanding, but as witness to a judgment already forming in real time. Jessica's eyes met mine again, and this time they did not move away quickly, but held steady with a certainty that suggested she believed the truth she was presenting had already been accepted by the room, even before a single response had been spoken. And as the silence deepened once more, I understood that whatever came next would not be a continuation of conversation, but the moment in which my place within this family would be publicly defined without my consent. Jessica's final words lingered in the air, but instead of ending the moment, they seemed to open a new layer of tension that had been building quietly beneath the surface the entire evening. The room did not react immediately, as if everyone was waiting for a signal that told them how to interpret what had just been said, and that hesitation itself became part of the pressure I felt surrounding me. I could see subtle changes in posture around the table, guests shifting their gaze between Jessica and me, trying to determine whether they were witnessing a confession, an explanation, or something closer to a final judgment. Jessica did not break eye contact this time, and her expression remained steady, controlled, almost calm in a way that made the situation feel even more formal, as if emotion had been replaced with structure. She continued speaking, now emphasizing how difficult it had been for her to reconcile love for her family with what she described as long-standing emotional consequences from the past, and her voice carried a certainty that suggested she believed the narrative she was presenting had already been validated in her mind long before this dinner. I remained seated without moving, aware that even the smallest reaction from me would likely be interpreted through the lens she had already established for the room. Robert Hayes finally exhaled audibly, a quiet sound that broke the stillness for a brief moment, but he did not speak, instead folding his hands again as though trying to contain the discomfort that was becoming increasingly visible in his expression. Emma looked toward me again, longer this time, her confusion deepening as she tried to understand why the atmosphere around her felt different from the family gatherings she had known before, while Lucas shifted slightly closer to his mother, as if seeking reassurance in the only stability he recognized in the moment. Jessica then turned slightly toward the rest of the guests, widening the scope of her words, and explained that healing within families often requires acknowledging painful truths, even when they are difficult to express publicly, and as she spoke, I could feel the framing of the evening solidifying into something that was no longer flexible. The guests did not interrupt, but their silence no longer felt neutral. It felt like participation without speech, an unspoken agreement to remain observers rather than participants. I noticed one woman across the table lower her eyes to her plate, while another gently adjusted her glass without drinking, small movements that reflected growing discomfort with the direction of the conversation. Jessica's tone remained composed, but there was now a subtle intensity beneath it, as if she were ensuring that every word aligned perfectly with the conclusion she intended the room to reach. She referenced responsibility again, not as a shared concept but as something that could be traced and assigned, and in that moment the space between her words and the attention of the room collapsed into a single focus. I felt the shift fully settle then, the transformation from family gathering into something resembling a structured account of the past, where one perspective was being carefully elevated while another was being quietly positioned as the source of explanation. And as Jessica finally paused again, letting the silence expand across the table, I understood with complete clarity that what remained was no longer about dialogue or understanding, but about whether I would be allowed to respond at all within the version of history that was being written in front of everyone. The silence that followed felt different from anything that had come before it that evening, no longer a pause waiting for continuation, but a suspended moment where the entire room seemed to be deciding what kind of truth it was willing to accept. Jessica remained standing at the head of the table, her posture unchanged, her expression steady, but now there was a subtle sense of finality in the way she held herself, as if the foundation of her argument had already been fully laid and what remained was simply its acceptance. She looked around the room slowly, allowing her gaze to meet each guest just long enough to make them feel included in what was about to be concluded, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a controlled certainty that suggested she believed the narrative had already become self-evident. She said that sometimes families reach a point where difficult conversations can no longer be avoided, and that silence itself can become a form of complicity when patterns continue across generations. As she spoke, I noticed that several guests no longer looked at me directly, instead focusing on the table, their hands or their glasses, as though avoiding direct acknowledgement might allow them to remain neutral participants rather than witnesses. Robert Hayes shifted slightly in his chair, his jaw tightening briefly before relaxing again, A small movement that suggested internal conflict but no outward resistance. Emma, still seated close to her mother, looked down at her lap, her young face tense in a way that suggested she could feel the emotional weight of the room, even if she could not fully understand its meaning. Lucas remained still, his attention fixed somewhere between the adults, absorbing the tone rather than the content of the words. Jessica continued, now describing how she had spent years trying to create stability for her children despite what she called lingering emotional influences from earlier family dynamics, and her phrasing grew more structured, more definitive, as if she were carefully closing every possible alternative interpretation. I could feel the atmosphere tightening further, not through raised voices or sudden movement, but through the collective stillness of people who were beginning to recognize that a conclusion was being formed in front of them without invitation for discussion. She paused briefly, then stated that acknowledging harm was not the same as assigning blame without reason, but rather understanding cause and effect within a family system, and as she said this, her eyes briefly returned to me with a focus that left no ambiguity about where that cause was being directed. The guests did not interrupt, but their silence was no longer passive. It had become structured, shaped by the unfolding narrative they were being asked to receive. I remained still, fully aware that any response from me would not be measured as explanation but as challenge against a version of events already taking shape in collective perception. Jessica's voice softened slightly as she continued, almost as if she were moving toward resolution, but the content of her words remained firm, emphasizing responsibility, emotional impact, and long-term consequences across generations. At that moment, I understood that the evening had fully transitioned beyond conversation, beyond disagreement, and even beyond accusation, into something closer to a public definition of identity being assigned in real time. And as she reached the end of her statement, allowing the final words to settle into the silence like a seal being placed on the moment, I realized that the room was no longer waiting for truth, but for acceptance of the truth she had already decided to present. The silence that filled the room after Jessica finished speaking did not dissolve, but instead settled deeper, becoming heavier with each passing second, as if the air itself had been assigned a verdict that no one felt authorized to challenge. I remained seated at the end of the table, aware that every subtle movement in the room now carried meaning, and that even the smallest shift in posture or gaze was being interpreted through the lens of what had just been declared. Jessica stood still, her expression composed in a way that suggested she believed the moment had reached its intended conclusion, yet the absence of any immediate response created a tension that made the finality feel incomplete rather than resolved. Around the table, guests avoided direct eye contact with me, their attention scattered across objects that allowed them to remain present without engagement, as if silence itself could serve as a form of distance. Robert Hayes leaned slightly back in his chair, his hands still folded, his face tense but controlled, showing no willingness to interrupt the structure of what had been established. Emma sat quietly, her shoulders slightly drawn inward, her eyes lowered, absorbing an atmosphere she was too young to fully interpret but old enough to feel as uncertainty. Lucas remained motionless, his focus fixed on the table's surface, his stillness reflecting confusion rather than understanding. Jessica finally broke the silence again, not with a new accusation, but with a continuation that reinforced the framing already set in place, stating that acknowledging harm within a family required courage and honesty, even when it disrupted comfort or tradition. Her voice remained steady, but the tone carried an unmistakable sense of closure, as though she were guiding the room toward agreement rather than inviting reflection. I noticed that no one contradicted her, and the absence of contradiction began to feel more significant than the words themselves, as if agreement had been formed not through speech but through the collective decision not to oppose what was being said. The chandelier light above the table reflected softly off the glassware, and in that stillness, even ordinary sounds like shifting fabric or faint breathing seemed amplified, adding to the sense that the room had narrowed its focus entirely onto a single interpretation of events. Jessica looked briefly toward the guests, then back to me, her expression unchanged, and in that brief exchange I understood that the narrative had already moved beyond discussion into presentation, where meaning was being assigned rather than explored. I could feel the weight of perception pressing inward from all sides, not through hostility, but through alignment, as more of the room settled into passive acceptance of the version being constructed in front of them. No one asked for clarification. No one offered an alternative perspective, and that absence created a structure of silence that felt more definitive than any spoken agreement. At that moment, I understood that the purpose of the gathering had shifted completely from sharing perspectives to solidifying a singular account, and that within this structure, my silence was no longer neutral but being interpreted as confirmation of the role assigned to me. The realization settled slowly but completely that the room was no longer waiting for truth to emerge, but for the moment when truth would be considered settled by consensus rather than conversation. The room remained frozen in a silence so complete that it felt almost intentional, as if even the passing of time had slowed in order to observe what would happen next. I stayed seated, aware that the weight of attention no longer shifted naturally between speakers, but had become fixed on a single unresolved point that everyone now seemed reluctant to address directly. Jessica stood at the head of the table without moving, her presence steady and controlled, yet no longer expanding the narrative she had built earlier, as though she had delivered everything she intended and was now allowing the room to absorb it without further guidance. Around the table, guests remained quiet, their expressions restrained, each one appearing to process the moment in isolation rather than collectively, which only deepened the sense of fragmentation in the atmosphere. Robert Hayes finally shifted his posture, leaning forward slightly as if preparing to speak, but no words followed, and after a brief pause he settled back again, his silence reinforcing the absence of any challenge to what had been established. Emma's gaze remained lowered, her hands resting still in her lap, while Lucas continued to sit quietly, his attention unfocused, as if the emotional tone of the room had exceeded what he could interpret. Jessica slowly turned her gaze across the table once more, and in doing so, she no longer appeared to be building an argument, but instead confirming that the argument had already been accepted through lack of opposition. The earlier tension that had filled the room had now transformed into something different, not active conflict, but structured stillness, where silence itself carried meaning. I could feel the shift fully settle into place, the sense that no further explanation would be offered, and that the version of events presented earlier now stood unchallenged simply because no one had chosen to contradict it. The guests remained seated without movement, their attention no longer searching for clarification, but retreating into quiet observation, as if the moment had passed from discussion into record. Jessica finally adjusted her stance slightly, her expression easing just enough to suggest that her role in the evening's narrative had reached completion, and in that subtle change I understood that what had just taken place was not only a conversation, but a permanent redefinition of how this room, these people, and this family gathering would be remembered. No one spoke, no one intervened, and in that collective silence, the conclusion that had been constructed earlier now appeared to stand without resistance, not because it had been proven, but because it had been allowed to remain unchallenged in the only place that mattered in that moment, the perception of everyone present.